Good morning, my friends. This is Paul, and if you're looking at the title of this video right now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, is YouTube being faulty? I didn't get a notification for your secondary functions video. And that's because I changed my mind about making it, at least for the time being. I might decide later. I tried filming it, but I thought it was just too hard to explain the difference between a dominant and a secondary function. They're basically just weaker versions of the dominant, or a soft equivalent, as some people would call it. And it was just too hard to give legitimate examples. So maybe if I have someone who's willing to collaborate with me, then maybe I'll give it a try again. But for now, I'm just going to go straight to the tertiary, inferior, and seventh functions and hope for the best. For the tertiary function, it's sometimes called the child function because a child is still in the development stages, so their mind and their bodies are still trying to formulate into a fully fledged adult. So in the same way, it's not that people ignore their tertiary functions, they often just don't develop it very much, and it can lead to it being a very weak expression or coming across as kind of underutilized and really, I guess, pathetic to the types that use it in the dominant. Are like, are you crazy? How can you be so pathetic at this? Well, that's what the thinkers would say. The feelers would probably be a bit more nice about it. But this is the function that usually after the person has taken some time to be aware of it and develop it, it can lead to being surprisingly effective. Usually it takes until a person's in their late 20s or 30s to figure out that this function is actually useful. So usually you don't see it a lot until you get to someone much older. But again, because it takes more time to refine, I think that people who develop their tertiary functions probably would end up using it better than people that have it in the dominant or secondary, because those people are so used to it that it's second nature and they don't often think about it. Whereas a person in the tertiary would have to put more effort and thought into their tertiary. So it would lead to them, because they're thinking about it more, they can decide when to use it and when not to use it. Hopefully, if you can know your own tertiary function and you're really good at it, it's probably because you had to develop it. So good for you. Just like with the previous video, we will be going in the order of my own function stack as an ISTJ to make it easier to keep track of. So we'll start out with introverted sensing. This is the tertiary function for INTPs and INFPs. In the tertiary function, these two types don't have the best memory, but they have a good enough memory where some of their past experiences can be kind of like a stepping stone for them to realize what it is that they want. I'll give you an example. So one of my favorite book series, apart from Harry Potter, is the Last Hobo trilogy. It's a true story of a man named Dan Greyjack who went on a hitchhiking journey across the US in search of some greater truth. Now he's an INTP, so of course he would be thinking about what makes sense to me? How does this world fit according to my internal logic? And his extroverted intuition is, of course, wanting to find a new way to appreciate that. So going on a hitchhiking journey, new sights, new possibilities. But his introverted sensing allowed him to categorize and compartmentalize his trip so that he was able to write a book about it and realize, oh yeah, my past experiences really did allow me to further have a specific type of thought to bolster my introverted thinking. Also, throughout the book, he's constantly referring back to familiar patterns and sources that he really admired. He'd often say, this experience reminds me of this lyric in a Beatles song that I really like. And so this is how I'm making sense of the event. In the case of the INFPs, I don't necessarily have an example, but I would say that their past experiences can often lead to them having a greater understanding of how they feel. I would say that these types don't have the best memory, but they have it good enough where it can lead to some kind of influence. Next up, we have extroverted thinking, which is the tertiary function for ESFPs and the ENFPs. With extroverted thinking in the tertiary, they're not the best at planning. They often like to be spontaneous and do things on the fly, and with introverted feeling being so high up, they often chase after their own desires before they think about what's logical. But oftentimes, when they desire to do something, unlike the ISFPs and the INFPs, where they like get in this endless cycle of non-productivity, ESFPs and ENFPs actually want what they're thinking about to be a reality, so their extroverted thinking is their way of making sure it gets done. An ESFP might desire to go on a roller coaster, but how are they going to go on the roller coaster if they don't physically put in the effort to make it happen? So when an ESFP, for example, is really wanting to get something done, he or she will use their extroverted thinking to develop an efficient plan to make it happen. However, because their extroverted thinking is really weak, they're not necessarily thinking about the statistics or the objective parameters of what it is they want to do. They might not have done all the research about maybe how this could be dangerous or how this could be unhealthy. And instead, they use just enough logic to make it done, but not enough to consider that maybe they're wrong. So I have found that when they use their extroverted thinking to plan things, in some instances they can even be better at planning than me. But they prefer not to use it all that often because that would take away from their base desires. But when they do use it, they're surprisingly effective. Next, we have introverted feeling, which is the tertiary function for ISTJs and INTJs. When introverted feeling is in the tertiary, this leads to them actually having quite a strong desire to be themselves, and they often have very firm beliefs and morals. But they often are reluctant to actually share those beliefs and morals and emotions with the world. Oftentimes they don't know how to emote what they're feeling, and so they can come across as monotone or even robotic, as some people call the ISTJs. Because unlike the other types, where like in the case of the SFPs and the NFPs, they're like constantly emotionally vomiting, or like the ENTJs and ESTJs where they like suppress their emotions so much that it comes out like a volcano when they finally snap. ISTJs and INTJs don't really do that a whole lot. Usually like their expressions are more of just very calm, very monotone, feeling very detached from emotions. That's not to say they don't have emotions. Oftentimes, I would say from my personal experience, I think they actually have stronger emotions than the higher up feelers. They just oftentimes use their extroverted thinking to say, is this really the best time to use my emotions? Is it effective? Is it going to get the job done? And does it make sense? Do the statistics say that I should be emotional right now? Am I feeling something that is counter to what is logical? So it can lead to them saying, I don't really see a need to express my emotions at this point. So it leads to them being a lot more introspective about when and how to actually use their emotions and values. But once they've developed it, it can lead to them having very surprising displays of what it is that they're feeling that can really impress the higher up feelers and actually make them feel better because they actually have to put in effort to express themselves. So oftentimes, because the other types aren't used to those expressions of emotion, they appreciate it more because it was harder. It's kind of like if, say, a romantic partner puts on a lot of effort to do a romantic date versus just like, oh, yeah, I just popped this up in a minute because I was too lazy. You're going to appreciate the person who put in the more effort because you're like, you did all that hard work just for me. It would be like if Jesus came to the earth and he just waved his hands and said, hey, your sins are forgiven, now you can all go to heaven. But instead, he chose to be crucified. He chose to suffer for our sins. And so more people respect him and admire him because he put in work, he put in torment to achieve his goal. And so in the same way, when, for example, An ISTJ might say, I think you're one of the people that I trust the most, and I really appreciate you. That'll make the higher up feelers go, oh, that's so sweet, especially because I know it was really hard for you to express that. And also, like, my INTJ best friend has gotten to the point where he's more accepting of his introverted feeling. And so he's gotten to the point where he now calls himself an open book and just kind of blurts out whatever he's feeling when he finds the need to. Next, we're moving on to extroverted intuition, which is the tertiary function for ESTJs and ESFJs. Usually with extroverted intuition, they don't like to stray too far from traditions and what's been established, but it tends to come out more in social situations where it can lead to them not wanting to be stuck to the same old thing and wanting to try out new possibilities, throw out ideas, say, I could give this a try. Oftentimes, it's not as strong, so it doesn't lead to them constantly brainstorming new ways to get a job done, but it can lead to them wanting to improvise if they come to an impasse in what they're trying to do. If they're so busy following the rules and then they just reach a moment where the rules just aren't enough, their intuition might say, let's try this new idea because the end justifies the means. We got to get it done. So if we have to do a new way to do it, so be it. When they've developed their extroverted intuition enough, this can lead to these types often having a surprisingly goofy sense of humor. And it can, especially for the ESTJs who are normally known for not really giving a darn about emotions, it can kind of give them this idea of fake emotions where they're like, able to make people laugh and can be the heart and soul of the party while at the same time still not putting on a huge display of what they're feeling. So it's definitely a heck of a lot better than mine because I'm usually like, if the rules say no, then I'm just going to give up on my goals. Whereas with those types, it might be their way of saying, yeah, no, I'm not giving up that easily. Now we're moving into the shadow functions. But thankfully, because they're weak for me and I'm already describing weak functions, this should make it a little bit easier to describe. Extroverted sensing is the tertiary function for ENTJs and ENFJs. When sensing is in the tertiary position, it can lead to them not being that great at living in the moment and just enjoying things as is. Oftentimes, they're very futuristic and goal driven, so they want to accomplish this revolution or they want to accomplish this business plan, but then they don't take enough time to just appreciate the moment. However, when it's developed, I've noticed that, especially in the case of the ENTJs, it can lead to them having a very adventurous side to them. Like when they're not working, they might want to try out some kind of cool, new, risky thing because same old is boring. Screw routine, let's try something different. But unlike, say, the ESTJs and the ESFJs, they'll want to do something that's tangibly possible. So instead of thinking of new possibilities, they might think of new tangible possibilities. So they might, I know an ENTJ friend of mine who I think is borderline INTJ, but that's beside the point, who, when we were hanging out, she was tired of just the fact that we always just walked and talked. So one day she just said, hey, let's walk on train tracks. Normally, I would have probably said, no way, that's too dangerous. But somehow, she managed to convince me. And I think because her extroverted thinking was so strong, she's like, what are the likelihood of the trains actually going by on the tracks? And so it was one of the very few times that I think I might have actually broken the rules. So ENTJs are surprisingly persuasive, but be careful about that because a lot of times they can use that for manipulation, for evil purposes. So try to be careful when they try to use that tactic on you. Their extroverted sensing also leads to them not getting too caught up in the future, like say the INFJs and the INTJs do. It can sometimes lead to them being ever so slightly more aware of what's going on around them. They're still really clumsy and not always the most observant types, but at the very least, it prevents them from looking like absolute idiots in public when they're like not noticing what's right in front of them. So they have at least a sort of awareness of their environment. Next up, we have introverted thinking, which is the tertiary function for INFJs and ISFJs. Oftentimes, INFJs and ISFJs, they focus so hard on what everyone else wants and what everyone else feels that sometimes it can be a little bit harder for them to think about their own understanding of the world and their own personal logical train of thought. However, because it's in the tertiary, they're often a lot more logical than you would think. Like they have their moments where they can just like start citing off a logical train. The problem is because it's in the tertiary, they often have a hard time explaining their logic, or because they're so used to using intuition, they might like talk around it or use like very vague, abstract terminology to try to help the other types understand. And if I had to guess, I'd say this is the main reason why INFJs in particular are often moaning and groaning about being misunderstood, because their introverted thinking is so weak and they're so bad at describing it that the other types are like, what are you even trying to say? But it does lead to them being very, very, almost at times stubborn with their points of view, because oftentimes when an INFJ or an ISFJ is convinced about something, because it's not using introverted feeling, it's not necessarily from a place of emotions or values. It's usually a place of personal understanding of how the world works. So oftentimes, because they think of it in such a logical way of thinking, because it's not a value, oftentimes it's even harder for them to explain it because they're not saying, this is how I feel, this is my conviction. So they sometimes think that it's objective when really it might not actually be objective. And when people try to disagree with them, it can lead to them, well, in the case of the INFJs, this is often where the door slam comes in, because they've exhausted their extroverted feelings so much trying to like give the other person extra chances that finally under stress their bottom two functions come out and their introverted thinking says, this is objectively bad for my health, and so for the sake of my well-being, it would be the most logical choice of action to get this person out of my life. As I'm saying this actually makes the door slam seem far less scary than I used to make it out. Maybe I should talk out my fears on camera more often. INFJs and ISFJs really shouldn't be taken for granted with how much their introverted thinking can be surprisingly effective. They're not these constant counselors who are emotional sponges and only ever think about the well-beings of others. They do have really good insights on how the world works. And a lot of times, like in particular my INFJ friends, when they've really thought something out, they often make me feel like a feeling type in particular because they've developed their introverted thinking so much that they have really, really strong logic. Now, again, maybe it's because they use introverted thinking and I use extroverted thinking that they're able to think for themselves more. And so they can actually grasp the concept of logic more than I can. Whereas I'm going to be thinking about what's proven to be true, what's more objective based on like the five senses and what cannot be denied no matter how much you try. They're going to try to like do some kind of mental computation, if that's a word, to like come to their realization. So in that sense, I've actually heard it said that introverted thinkers can actually grasp what logic is on a conceptual level way more than the extroverted thinkers can. So kudos for you. This might be one of the few times you're ever told by a thinker that you're more logical than one. Now we move on to extroverted feeling, which is the tertiary function for ENTPs and ESTPs. Did I say ENTPs? I hope I did. This leads to them liking harmony and making sure everyone is included, but because it's so weak, they often can sometimes use it for manipulation or just to have fun. it can lead to them like being trolls, for example, because they like to get a certain reaction out of people. And because their extroverted feeling is strong enough, they can often tell what'll get a rise out of people. And so they'll take pleasure from being like, oh gosh, I just made everyone mad. I got a dopamine rush from that. So instead of being kind and compassionate and considerate, like the higher up extroverted feelers would be, it can sometimes be used as a means for them trying to understand people and trying to have fun. However, when it's developed, it leads to them having a shockingly good empathetic system. Oftentimes, when I'm around ENTPs and ESFPs, they have a, or ESTPs, they have a very welcoming air to them that ESFPs and ENFPs sort of have, but it's different. For them, they're just like overflowing with their own excitement and their own personal feelings, that it can definitely lead to like fake extroverted feeling. Whereas with ESTPs and ENTPs, they are truly like ignoring their own impulses in the moment. In fact, they kind of do by default because introverted feeling is in their blind spot. They are truly only thinking about the other person. They are so concerned about making sure everyone is happy that they're doing it for the sake of doing it. There's no internal motivation whatsoever. They're just like, hey, you're on the outside. Come join us, buddy. They have a good way of drawing me out of my shell when I'm in a big crowd because I'm more of a one-on-one, one-on-two type of person. And so when I'm in a big crowd, I tend to be much quieter than I would be in a one-on-one setting. And so oftentimes, if there's an ENTP or an ESTP there, they will be the ones that are like, Paul, you haven't said anything yet. Do you want to contribute to the group? So I think if you get the impression that ESTPs and ENTPs are just cold and calculating all the time, you probably haven't met one that's developed their extroverted feeling enough. Now we get into introverted intuition. I hope I can explain it better since it's in a lower position. This is the tertiary function for ISFPs and ISTPs. Oh gosh, I'm already struggling to know where to begin. Normally, introverted intuition is a function that involves looking deeper at what does everything mean, what is the ultimate meaning behind how everything is connected, and it especially leads to them being very futuristic. ISTPs and ISFPs don't like being futuristic, but it can lead to them having a surprisingly deep insight into, like, say, a piece of art that has a deeper meaning to it. I might see a movie and be totally lost if it's like very abstract, whereas an ISFP or an ISTP might say like, yeah, I'll explain it for you, Paul. This is what all that symbolism meant. And I'm like, how the heck did you figure that out when you're also a sensor like me? And they're like, well, they gave little clues throughout, and I'll be totally lost. So they often have a surprisingly deep side to them that they just don't want to reveal to the world. They also, from my understanding, they can also use it to like make sure that they're not only in the moment and that maybe they can get farther ahead in life, but oftentimes they don't put much stock into it. Like an ISFP might have like a dream or a desire, and then their introverted intuition is a way of getting toward that desire. So maybe an ISFP is like an artist. That's the stereotype, but I can't think of anything else at the moment because I don't know too many ISFPs. And their introverted intuition might say, how do I create a future where my art can be seen by more people? And I would imagine it leads to them being relatively good at being futuristic. My mom, I'm almost positive, is an ISFP. And while she's very in the moment and like I'm just going to focus on the now and I'm not going to worry about anything else. She's often the one explaining to me and my dad, like, oh yeah, when I watched that movie, I could tell the hidden meaning behind everything. Or like when, say, there's red flags about someone, she'll often get this gut feeling that maybe something is wrong. And so oftentimes we trust her as like the one that understands everything the most. I think that's another thing about ISFPs and ISTPs is that they have a certain understanding of implications that you don't often hear about very much because they don't often broadcast it. Now, this could just be in the case of the ISTPs. Maybe the ISFPs aren't so good at it. But I've noticed I have an ISTP friend that's usually telling me like, "Hey, Paul, that wasn't the most socially appropriate thing to do." And I'll be like, "Why? People are just getting upset over nothing." And they'll be like, "No, no, you could definitely tell that there were the vibes of discomfort there." So maybe it's because ISTPs use extroverted feeling in the inferior and it was just significantly well developed for that particular one. But they're often the ones that are telling me, like, hey, you might not be able to catch the hidden meanings, but I do. So please pay some heed to my words. That was far less exhausting than the previous video, so thank you very much for watching. I am greatly looking forward to the inferior and the blind spot videos coming to an end. Please let me know in the comments what type you are, what you think. Do you relate, not relate to any of these? Keep in mind that I do read and respond to pretty much every comment I get. So don't be shy about sharing your thoughts and expecting me to share my thoughts to your thoughts. Special thanks to my patrons Matthew Rakowski, Spoon Ghost Splatcat, and Scrooterdoodles for their financial contributions. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye!